I want to begin by thanking your pastor and my dearest of friends, Allison, for inviting me to share a message with you on this, the most joyful day of the Christian liturgical year. For all of us, this past year has been a most difficult one on so many levels and in so many ways. And as we come to its end, many of us are personally spent. We are collectively exhausted. And during these days, when we most need the comfort of family and friends, many of us have to pass our time in the dullness of isolation, an isolation which is particularly lonely and painful for those who have suffered the life-changing loss of loved ones. So much has changed. So many holidays, special family occasions, and even everyday activities have been cancelled, postponed, or moved online. In the midst of all of this, Christmas 2020 probably feels like just one more thing that is going to be different and difficult. We are simply worn out. Our world is weary. Yet, here we are, gathered virtually as a community of faith in the darkest time of the year, a time of short days and cold nights, to remember and to celebrate the birth of a little boy in less than ideal circumstances some 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem. But what is utterly amazing about our celebration of this memory is that it can illuminate the darkness of our own less than perfect circumstances to be a holy darkness, a holy night. So although worn out and weary, our celebration of the birth of Jesus can make our worn out souls feel their worth again. But we must choose to allow it to do so. It can rouse in our lonely and grief-stricken selves a thrill of hope again. But we must choose to allow it to do so. And it can bring about in the less than perfect circumstances of our weary world rejoicing again. But we must choose to allow it to do so. There is no doubt that the political, environmental, and medical trials we face are real. There is no doubt that the sufferings of isolation, loss, and injustice are real. There is no doubt that the thrill of hope and rejoicing which can accompany our celebration of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth are also real. To paraphrase one of our Christmas carols, O holy night of Jesus' birth, he appeared, and the worn-out soul felt its worth again, a thrill of hope, and the weary world rejoices again. For in the less than perfect circumstances of our world breaks a new and glorious morn. This carol perfectly summarizes the essential message of today's reading from John's Gospel. In him was life, and that life is the light of all humankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Before commenting on the reading from John's Gospel, it seems important to point out that only two of the authorized Gospels, Matthew and Luke, begin with narratives of Jesus' birth, whereas the first of the canonical Gospels to be written, Mark, and the last of them to be written, John, neither has infancy narratives. Mark's Gospel, written sometime around 66, begins with Jesus as an adult choosing to be baptized by John the Baptist and thereby becoming the long-awaited Messiah. The next Gospel to be written, Matthew, written sometime around 80, to a Jewish audience, begins with an infancy narrative which traces the human genealogy of Jesus through his father Joseph back to David and Abraham, so as to establish Jesus to be the legitimate heir to the royal house of David. Without Jesus' Davidic legitimacy, Matthew could not authoritatively proclaim this Jesus to Jews as the long-promised fulfillment of the law and of prophets, the long-promised fulfillment of all the hopes of Israel. The next Gospel to be written, Luke, written sometime around 85 to a Gentile audience, begins with an infancy narrative which traces Jesus' human genealogy not back to David and Abraham, but all the way back to the mythological beginning of all humans, namely to Adam. Without Jesus being genealogically placed at the primordial origin of all humanity, Luke could not authoritatively proclaim Jesus' mission to be so universal that it has room enough for all humans, for all Gentiles and Jews, for all women and men, for all enemies and friends. John's Gospel, written sometime around 100, has no infancy narrative, and so there is no human genealogy. What there is instead is a divine genealogy. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life is the light of all humankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Without this divine genealogy, John could not authoritatively proclaim Jesus to be divinity's internal self-expression, that is, the Word of God, through whom divinity empties itself externally so as to bring into being the universe and all its many beings. However, it is not until chapter 4, verse 16 that John spells out with sheer simplicity why it is in the nature of divinity to empty itself by giving itself away, not only without ceasing to be itself, but precisely is itself by giving itself away. God, he proclaims, is love, and all who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. In other words, love cannot and does not contain itself within itself, but in faithfulness to itself, It gives itself away and so is itself. So in being true to itself as love, divinity gives itself away. It empties itself externally. And in this self-emptying, the universe and all its many beings come into being as intimates of divinity, or as Christianity likes to put it, as children of God. And so, here we are, gathered virtually on Christmas morning. It seems reasonable enough to wonder why, year after year, people gather to hear and rehear the well-worn legend of a child's birth. Perhaps we do so because, though his birth was unremarkable, this child, according to the old story, would grow up to say and do things so astonishing that for 100 generations, many would use his words and deeds to arrange their lives, and some still genuinely attempt to do so today. It is not unusual to find all that he said and did condensed into the simple claim that God is love, and that love is the only engine of human survival and fulfillment. He is reported to have said to the women and men of his generation, "Love your neighbor, love your enemy. All who live in love live in God, and God lives in them." He is said to have told them always to meet evil with forthright loving kindness, no matter what. The story of his words and deeds led a poet to declare that he has left us some splendid metaphors and a doctrine of forgiveness that can do away with the past. Though his reported words and deeds are exceedingly remarkable, what is perhaps even more remarkable is the fact that some people gather on this day believing, as no doubt countless others have before, that there is more to this vulnerable baby boy than meets the eye. One way of putting their faith would be to say that they see in him the revelation of the awesome and inescapable nearness of that mystery from which all comes and to which all returns. They see in him, in other words, the Word of God. But what makes their continuing faith so remarkable is not the birth of this child, not what he said and did, but his horrible end. For when he was much, much younger than I am, he was brutally tortured and murdered for simply telling people that it was more important to love each other than to obey the laws of church and state, that it was essential to cherish all human beings without exception, and that it was vital to forgive whatever needs to be forgiven, that if we live in love, we live in God, and God lives in us. Those who killed him probably thought that's the end of it, he's dead and gone, but yet 2,000 years or so later, people are still gathering with family and friends and strangers in little villages and large cities, online and in person, to commemorate his birth. They even assume that the words of a prophet of ancient Israel refer to him, and so they call him Emmanuel, Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace. On this day, when throughout our world our fears and our hopes seem all too mingled again, when our weary world seems to resist tumbling into despair again, when our ragged souls seem to feel their worth again, could it be that somehow the memory and celebration of the birth of this child brings to mind a nobility to which we are called and of which we are obedientially capable, namely, the ennobling ability to imitate him in all that we think, do, and say, and thereby make manifest the awesome and inescapable nearness of that mystery from which all comes and to which all returns. Is it our remembering of this latent nobility in us which makes our worn-out soul feel its worth again? Could it be that wherever actual hints of this nobility are found, wherever people fumblingly attempt to cherish each other and awkwardly try to forgive whatever needs forgiving, could it be that there the memory of what he said and did comes alive again in us once more? Is this living memory our light in the darkness, a light which beckons us and our world from the allure of despair to a new and glorious hope? Perhaps. If so, would that this memory continuously live in our hearts and in our world, so that we and our world may be rendered ever more humane, ever more holy, even in the darkest of times. Could this be the longing that brings us together today? Could this be the longing contained in people wishing each other a blessed Christmas? Maybe, just maybe. If so, a blessed Christmas to us all and to our world. God bless.